Today's story is Farewell Miss Julie Logan by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 1. The English. This is December the 1st, 1860-something. I think it is prudent to go no nearer to the date, in case what I am writing should take an ill turn or fall into curious hands. I need not be so guarded about the weather. It is a night of sudden blasts that half an hour ago threw my window at me. They went skirling from room to room like officers of the law seeking to seize and deliver to justice the venturesome Scots minister who is sitting here ready to impeach all wraiths and warlocks. There was another blaster now. I believe I could rope the winds of the manse to my bidding tonight, and by running from door to door, opening and shutting, become the conductor of a gay, sinister orchestra. I'm trying to make a start, but the diary the English have challenged me to write. There is no call to begin tonight, for as yet not a flake has fallen in this, my first winter in the glen, and the diary is to be a record of my life here during the weeks, well, just said it may be months, in which the glen is locked, meaning it may be so happy in snow that no one who is in can get out of it, and no one who is out can get in. Then, according to the stories that crawl like mists among our hills, where the English must have picked them up, come forms called the strangers. You go queer yourself without knowing it, and walk and talk with these doolies, thinking they are of your world, till maybe they have mischieved you. It is all, of course, superstitious havers, bred of folk who are used to the travail of out of doors, and take ill with having to squat by the salt bucket. But I have promised with a smile to keep my eyes and ears intent for tersifications among my flock, and to record them for the benefit of the English when they come back next August. My name is the Reverend Adam Yestreen, and to be candid, I care not for the Adam with its unfortunate associations. I'm 26 years of age, and though long in the legs, look maybe younger than is seemly in my sacred calling, being clean-shaven without any need to use an implement. Indeed, I may say I have desisted for 2 years back. I took a fair degree at St. Andrews, but my intellectuals suffered from an addiction to putting away my books and playing on the fiddle. When I got my call to this place, my proper course was to have got rid of the fiddle before I made my entry into the glen, which I did, walking with affected humility behind 3 cartloads of furniture all my own, and well aware, though I looked down, that I was being keeked at from every window, of which there are about 2 to the mile. When the English discovered how ashamed I was of my old backsliding with the fiddle, they had the effrontery to prig with me to give them a tune. But I hope it is unnecessary for me to say that they had to retire discomfited. I have never once performed on the instrument here, though I may have taken it out of its case nows and nans to fondle the strings. What I miss, when my unstable mind is on the things of this world, is less my own poor cajoling with the gut than not hearing the tunes from better hands. The more homely Scottish lilts, I mean, for of course the old reprehensible songs that kowtowed to the Stuarts find no asylum with me. Though but half a Highlander, I have the Gaelic sufficiently to be able to preach in it once every Sabbath, as enjoined. But the attendances are small, as, except for Stravagers, there are not so many pure Highlandmen nowadays in the glen. My manse and kirk are isolated on one side of the burn, and the English call them cold as paddocks. Methinks a noble look falls on them when the Sabbath bell is ringing. My predecessor, Mr. Carley, tore down the jargonal tree, which used to cling to my gable end, because he considered that, when in flourish, or as the English say, in blossom, a word with no gallantry in tilt, it gave the manse the appearance of a light woman. The marks are still scarred on the wall. Round the manse, within a neat paling that encloses my demesne, there are grosart bushes, rizzers and rasps, ageen, beeskeps, and the like, that in former hands were called the yard, but I call it the garden, and have made other improvements. The gain is my only tree, but close by is a small wood of fir and birch, with a path through it that since long before my time has been called the thinking path, because so many ministers have walked up and down it before the diets of worship, with their hands behind their backs. I try to emulate them, but they were deeper men than I am, and many a time I forget to think, if such has been my intention. In other days a squirrel frequented this wood, and as you might say adopted one minister after another, taking nuts from their hands, though scorning all overtures from the laity. But I have never seen it, and my detractors, of whom there are a flow, though I think I am well licked as a whole, say that it deserted the wood as a protest when it heard that I preached in a gown. There is a deal of character about the manse, particularly of course in the study, which is also my living room. It and my dining room are the only 2 rooms in the glen, except at the grand house, without a bed in them, And I mention this not with complacence to show how I live nowadays, but as evidence that we are a thrifty people, though on Sabbath well put on. Some are also well plenished within, and to have their porridge with porter instead of milk is not an uncommon occurrence. The finest of my gear, all the chairs and horsehair, belong to the dining room, which, however, is best fitted for stately occasions, and you would know it is seldom used by the way the fire smokes. I cannot say that I am at ease in it, while on the other hand I never enter my study up the stair without feeling me a sip, to which one may say it responds. Never have I a greater drawing to my study than when the lamp is lit, and the low from the fire plays on my red curtains and the blue camp stain and my clouty rug. It is an open fireplace, without a grate. I used to be ashamed of its wood and peat scattering such a mess of ashes, till the English told me the piles of ashes are of a great adornment, since when I have conflicted with my bit maid, because she wants to carry them away daily, not having the wit to know that they are an acquisition. Most of my wall space, and especially 2 presses, are sternly lined with mighty books, such as have made some of my congregation thankful that they have never learned to read. Yet it is a room that says to any one of spirit, "Come in by and take a chair, not only a chair, but the best chair," which is the high-backed grandee, agreeably riven in the seat. I seldom occupy it myself, except at a by-time on a Sabbath afternoon, when the 2 diets have exhausted me a wee, but Dr. John sinks into it as naturally as if he had brought it at the root. This was the auction of such plenishings as Mr. Carluke did not take away with him, and in the inventory there was mentioned as part of the study furniture, a servant's chair, which puzzled some of the bidders, but I saw through it at once. It meant, not to his glorification, that a kitchen chair was kept here for the servant to sit on, and this meant that he held both morning and evening family exercise in the study, which meant again that he breakfasted and supped here, for he wouldn't have had 2 fires. It made me smile in a tolerant way, for one would have thought, on the night I spent with him, that the dining room was his common resort. On the other side of the burn, but so close that I can keep a vigilant eye on them, are the 5 houses in a row, which the English say, incorrectly but with no evil design, contain all the congregation I can depend upon in attack of wild weather. On the contraire, there is a handful of small farms in the glen, 4 by shepherds' sheelings and bothies, and occasional roadside digging of clay and divot in which may be man or beast. Truly, when I chap, I am sometimes doubtful which will come to the door. The English, who make play with many old words that even our Highlandmen have forgotten, call the 5 houses the clachan. They're 1-story houses, whitewashed and thatched, and every one of them, to the astonishment of the English, has a hallan to itself. We may be poor, say the Scottish, but we will not open into a room. The doors face the glen road, on which grows a coarse bent grass in lines as straight as potato drills, and carriage folk who do not keep the ruts are shaken most terribly. One of the English told me that his machine sometimes threw him so high in the air that when he was up there he saw small locks hitherto unknown to man, and stopped his beast and fished them. The English, however, who have many virtues, though not of a very solid kind, are great exaggerators. The carriage folk, except when she lets what is familiarly called the grand house to the English, consist of Mistress Lindenach alone, who is called, but never to her face, the old lady. She has 2 spirited ponies, but not so spirited as herself. She goes to Edinburgh while the grand house is let, and excepting myself, on account of my office, she is the chief person in the glen. She has been a fine friend to me, but I have sometimes to admonish her for a little coarseness in her language, which may escape from her even when she is most genteel. I grieve to say that this lady of many commendable parts plays cards, and I once saw her at it. Her adversary was a travelling watchmaker, one of those who traverse the whole land carrying a wooden box of watches on his back, with a dozen more ticking in his many waistcoat pockets. They were playing for high sums, too, the old lady sitting inside one of her windows, and the man outside it on his box. I think this is done to preserve the difference in rank, but when I called her before me for it, she said the object was to make all right for her future, as the players being on different sides of the window took away the curse. She's also at times overly sly for one so old and little, and I am now referring to my gown. Soon after my settlement, the ladies of the congregation presented me with a gown, and she, as the most well to pass, was the monetary strength of the movement. But though I was proud to wear my gown, without vainglory, we had members who argued that it was a touch of Rome, One may say that the congregation was divided and entered, and some Sabbaths I was sore bested whether to put it on or not. Whilst the decision was even taken out of my hands, for the gown would disappear at the back end of the week and be returned to its nail on the Monday morning, the work undoubtedly of the no-gown party. On those occasions, of course, I made shift without it, and feeling ran so high that I could not but be conscious as I ascended the pulpit that they were titting at one another's sleeves. They invented the phrase, a gown Sabbath. I took to hiding it, but whoever were the miscreants, and well I knew they were in the pews in front of me, looking as if they'd never heard the word gown, they usually found my huddy place. I mind once, sitting on it a long Saturday night when I was labouring at my sermon, the which incident got about among my people. The old lady was very sympathetic, and pressed me to lay the trouble before the session, which, in fairness to her, as the outstanding subscriber, I ettled to do, until, could anyone believe it, I discovered that she was the miscreant herself. I sorted her for it. She's back again now, for the English, of course, have departed long since, and will not be seen again in the glen till next year's shooting time comes round. On the day they left, they crossed over to remind me that they were looking forward to the diary, and when I protested that I did not even know how to begin, they said in their audacious way, "Oh, you could begin by writing about us." I've taken them at their word. They little understand that I may have been making a quiet study of them, while they thought that I was the divert. As I say, I found them to be very pleasant persons, so long as you make allowances for them that one could not be expected to make for his own people. The bright array of their kilts is a pretty bit of colour to us, the trousered people of the glen. They have a happy knack of skimming life that has a sort of attraction for deeper, but undoubtedly slower natures. The way they write with their pockets is beyond words. I'm credibly informed by Posty that they even have worms sent to them by post in tins. They're easy to exploit for gain, as Posty was quick to see, and many a glass of, as he, to my grief, for I am a totaler, got from them by referring to himself as she. I have written that word with a dash. The drink. Now I cast back. I believe I have never heard it spoken by the glen folk. One might say that it is thus pronounced by them. They invite you to partake, and you are dull in the uptake if you don't understand of what you are being asked to partake. They make a complete sentence by saying of a friend, "He's the one who on market day," and leaving the rest to the listener's common sense. Similarly, they say, "He never, unless he is in company," or "He is just at a time because he is lonely like." Now the English in this matter, as in many others, are different, and they give the thing its name, and boldly say, with pride in knowing the word, "Uscuba." In this I hold that they come out of the murky affair with greater honesty, but more shamelessly than we do. They were hospitable to me, and had me up at the grand house once, giving me the most attractive lady to take in on my arm to dinner, and putting the most popular man on the other side of her to make up for me. They're so well-meaning that it would have vexed them to know I noticed this, and of course I gave it the go-by. But there were few things that escaped my observation. On the Sabbath, there were always some of them in the kirk, where they were very kindly to the plate, but lazy at turning up the chapters. When they had new arrivals, these were always brought to see the shepherd's dogs in the pews. In fact, I've decided that the one thing the English know for certain about Scottish religion is that there are shepherd's dogs in the pews. The English, how quick they are compared to a cautious Scot like myself. You may be far deeper in the fundamentals when there is time to take surroundings, but they are so ready. This time I dined with them. The talk might be on subjects I was better versed in than any of them, but they would away to another topic before I could steady myself and give utterance. My most pitiful posture was when I was unable not only to say a thing worthwhile, but to say anything at all, however superficial. Is man ever more lonely than in company when all languages forsake him, and he would be thankful if he could cry out Agamemnon? At that dinner, I sometimes wished I could have had a dictionary on my knee so as to get hold of any word whatever. The man on the other side of the lady I was in charge of made a flattering remark to her about her looking very pretty tonight. They stick at nothing. And said to me across her, did I not agree with him? It may just have been a considerateness in him to bring the dumb into the talk, a meritorious quality they have, but to be approached in such a direct manner about a lady's looks before her face threw me off my balance. And all I could reply was that I had not given the subject sufficient consideration to be able to make a definite statement about it. She stopped quickly at that, like one looking for her feet, but on reflection I had a suspicion she was anxious not to let me see her making a mouth, which they're great adepts, and she will never know now that I can say a neat thing myself, if they'll give me time. The thoughtlessness of them is something grievous, but their manners make me wave my own. When they say goodbye to me at the 5 houses, their departure was like a flight of birds. As the poet says, they seem to take away the sun in their pockets. At the manse I'd shown them my study, this room I'm now sitting in, with the wind still on the rampage, and especially I drew their attention to what I have called the finest blanching thereof, the 2 presses containing theological and classic tomes of great girth, somewhat warped in the binding. My friends cried out at this being all the reading I had to carry me through the time when the glen may be locked, and they sniffed, but in a polite way, at the closeness of my cosy room, not understanding, as any Presbyterian would have done, that what they mistook for mustiness was the noble smell of learning. The lady said that what I needed to madden me pleasantly was not a diary, but a wife. They're at the 5 houses by this time, getting into their machines, and I counted them with, "Who would have me?" I was not putting them to the question, but all the ladies cried out, "I will," and made pretence to want to leap from their carriages. I can see now they were just getting after me. Such are this strange race, the English, whose light-heartedness, as in this extraordinary scene, can rise to a pitch called by the French abandon. I dare say they'd forgotten all about me before they're out of the glen, and will never have another thought of the diary. Indeed, now as I look at my shelves of massive volumes which were not of my collecting, I wish I had not agreed to call it a diary, for that is a word of ill omen in this manse. Chapter 2. Someone who was with him. December 3rd. I have read the above more than once, and then hid it away from Crystalie because it is written on sermon paper. Crystalie is a most faithful young woman, with a face as red and lush as a rasp, who knows her characters both ways, and has such a reverence for ministers that she looks upon me more as an edifice than a mortal. She has an almost equal pride in herself for being a minister's servant, and walks into the kirk in her cheap elastic sides with an official gentility that some consider offensive. She has also a provoking way of discussing me in my presence as if I was not there, telling visitors the most intimate things about me, such as the food I like but does not like me, the while she stands in what is meant to be a respectful attitude, neither inside nor outside the door. My visitors are likely to be few for some time to come, neighbours from the 5 houses whiles, and I hope Mistress Lindenuk and Dr. John from Brandes. The smith at the 5 houses is my chief elder, and as his bairns are innumerable, the family in their 2 pews are a heartsome sight. A more cautious man in argument I have never known. About as far as he will go is, "I agree with you to a certain extent," or "My answer to that is yes and no." Posty has a story that he made the second of these answers at his marriage when asked if he took this woman. Posty is also at the 5 houses, and is the kind that bears ill will to none, even if they catch him cheating at the dambret, which he does with the elbow. He has the cheery face that so often goes with roguery and being good at odd jobs, but though I don't lip into him in matters of import, I like to fall in with him more than with some better men. I sometimes play at the teetotum with the smith's bairns, when there is a prize of cracknuts, and undoubtedly on such occasions Posty's pranks add to the festive scene. He will walk miles, too, to tell any ill news. His most valued possession is a velocipede, which has so often come to bits when he was on it that near every man in the glen has been at the repairing of it, including myself, or at least have contributed twine or iron girds. He brings the letters from Brandes on this machine, and as it often runs away from him, we all, dogs, hens, and humans, loop the dyke when we see him bearing down on us. He carries telegrams too, but there are so few of these now the English have gone, that when we see him waving one, we ask, "Who is dead?" My great friend is Dr. John, who is sometimes in the glen to succour us, though he lives at Brandes, where he sits under Mr. Watery, with whom I sometimes suffer near a pulpit. Brandes is an overgrown place of 500 inhabitants, and stands high near a loch, out of which 2 streams run in opposite directions, like parties to a family feud that can no longer be settled with the claymore. In a spate, as many new bairns come crawling into this loch as there are hairs on a woman's head, and they are gone before they can be counted. Brandes is not in the glen, but just at the head of it, and according to Dr. John, it stopped there because it said to itself, "Those who go farther will fare worse." It is jimply 6 miles from my manse in summer weather, but 17 from the nearest railway station and electric telegraph. Dr. John says that whether Brandes is on the beginning or end of desolation depends on your looking up or down the road. A gnarled, pajink little figure about 50 is Dr. John, grandly bearded, but for a man of larger size. His blue eyes are hid away in holes, sunken into them, I suppose, because he has looked so long on snow. He wears a plaid in all weathers, and sometimes even in the house, for, as he says, before he has time to wipe it off and find it again, somebody on a cart horse will be clattering to his door to hurry him to my glen. I've seen him too, sitting behind on that clattering horse. Repute says that for humane ends he will get through when the glen is locked to all others. His sole recompense may be a ham at the killing, or a kebbuck, or a keg of that drink I've spelt. Though I touch it not, I cannot deny that he partakes as if it were water, and is celebrated and even condoled with for never being the worse of it. He always takes it hot, which he calls never mixing his drinks, and I don't know a neater hand at squeezing down the sugar with the ladle. If he is in the glen, he sometimes puts up his shalt at the 5 Houses and stays the night with me, and we have long cracks, the kettle lid popping while he smokes his pipe, grunting, which is the Scottish way of bringing out the flavour. Last night was such an occasion, and up here in the study, as we sat into the fire, we got onto the stories about strangers, of which he says humorously he has heard many clutters, though he has never had the luck to encounter the Carlsons themselves. He maintains that the origin of all the claybirds and clacking of nowadays was that lamentable affair of the 45, which, among its misdeeds, for long gave an ill name to the tartan. The glen had been a great hiding place of pretty men of the period, and among its fearsome crags and war cloughs, if ancient tales be true, these ill-got gentlemen had lurked for months, and some of them for years. It is said that forebears of folk still in the glen used to see them from below searching for roots between the rocks, and so distraught with hunger that they went on searching openly, while they were being shot at by the redcoats who would not face the spiel. When the glen was in a sink of snow, and pursuit for a time at an end, they sometimes lay at the grand house, which was loyal to their dark cause, and held secret carouse there. They were talked of with an intake of breath by the glen folk, who liked best to be of no party unless they were of both, would not betray them to an enemy that hunted them with bloodhounds, yet would hold no intercourse with them willingly, and looked the other way if they came upon one of those gaunt red shanks unexpectedly, as sometimes happened, carrying braxy mutton or venison to his lurking place, or a salmon that the otters had left by the burn after taking one nip from its neck. Those glen folk were too mouse to call the fugitive Jacobites. The strangers, they said. In one case, they said, someone who was with him, as if that was as far as it was canny to go. The him was the stranger who was believed by the simple to have been the Chevalier himself. He is said to have lain in the glen for a time in July month, fevered, and so hard-pressed that no friends dared go nigh him with nourishment, lest it led to his capture. I've not seen his hoddy place, but the doctor tells me it is still there, and is no more than a lair beneath what we call a bield, a shelter for sheep. Very like it began by being a tod's hole, and was torn bigger with dirks. If it ever existed, the lair has been long filled up with stones, which are all that remain to mark the royal residence. Sheep again shelter in the bield, but there were none there in the time of the prince, if it was he, nor, as I say the story goes, could food be passed to him. In his extremity he was saved by the mysterious someone who was with him. Of course, the legend has it that she was young and fair and of high degree, and that she loved much. She fed him with the unwilling help of the eagles. The Eagle's Rock, which is not far from the bield, is a mighty mass, said by the gillies of today to be unscalable by man because of what is called the Logan stone. No eagles build there now. They have fallen to the guns of their modern enemy, the keepers, who swear that one pair of eagles will carry 100 grouse or more to their nest to feed their young. At that time there was an eagle's nest on the top of the rock. The climb is a perilous one, but now and again hardy folk get up as far as the Logan stone, where they turn back. There are Logan stones, I'm told, throughout the world, and they are rocking stones. It is said they may be seen rocking in the wind and yet hold on for centuries. Such a monster hangs out from our Eagle's Rock, and you cannot reach the top save by climbing over it, nor can you get onto it without leaping. Twice men of the glen have leapt, and it threw them off. Natheless, the story is that this someone who was with him got through the searchers in the dark, reached the top of the rock by way of the Logan stone, and after sometimes fighting the parent eagles for possession, brought down young grouse for her lord. By all kind accounts she was a maiden, and in our glen she is remembered by the white heather, which, never seen here till then, is said nonsensically to be the marks of her pretty naked feet. The white heather brought her little luck. In a hurried and maybe bloody flitting, she was left behind. Nothing more is recorded of her except that when her lord and master embarked for France, he enjoined his Highlanders to feed her and honour her as she had fed and honoured him. They were faithful, though misguided, and I dare say they would have done it if they could. Some think that she is in the bield, in the hole beneath the stones, still waiting. They say maybe there was a promise. Such was the doctor's tale as we sat over the fire. A wayward woman was how he summed her up, with a shake of the head. Chapter 3, The Spectrum. December 3rd, continued. I'm thinking, Dr. John was saying when I caught up with him again, for my mind had been left behind with this woman, and I was wondering if she was wayward, and what was wrong with it, for I liked the word. I'm thinking that all the clash about the folks of nowadays meeting strangers when the glen is locked come out of the troubled past. In a white winter, as you have delused yourself, there's a little dark for a hardy race. They hark back by the hearthstone to the forgotten, aye, and the forbidden. But I assure you, Mr. Yestreen, despite the whispers, the very name of the 45 is now buried in its own store. Even Posty, though he's so glad with the pipes, gets by himself if you press him about what his old ballads mean. Neither good luck nor mischief, so far as I can discover, comes to the Harvilles of nowadays who think they've talked or walked with a stranger. Unless, indeed, as some say, it was one of them who martyred poor Mr. H. And I understand he, being a learned man, always called it a spectrum. This set us talking of him of whom I may have already let out that he once kept a diary in this manse. It was so far back as to be just hearsay even to Dr. John, and belongs to the days when there were no seats in my kirk and all stood on their shanks. Though I say we talked about him, we really said very little, unless an occasional furtive glance be speech. All in these parts become furtive when a word, falling as meaningless, you would say, as a cinder from the fire, brings a sour the old man back to the mind. Mr. H. was a distant predecessor of mine, and a scholar such as the manse is not likely to house again. It was he who collected the library of noble erudition that is in the presses of this room, many of the volumes bound by his own hands that may have doubted them as he bound. His diary was written on the fly-leaves of a number of them. I believe he thought in Latin and Greek quicker than in his own tongue, but his hurried notes are often in those languages, and the more deliberate ones in ours. I am in a dancer's cap with the Greek, but I can plod along with the Latin dictionary, and his entries in the Latin have made me so uneasy that I have torn out the pages and burned them. Mr. Carluke, whom I succeeded, had to confine himself, having no Latin, to the English bits, and he treated some of them similarly, for, as he said to me, they were about things that will not do at all. They appear suddenly amidst matter grandly set forth, as if a rat had got at the pages. Minute examination has made me question their being in the same handwrite, though an imitation. This tampering, if such it was, had got by Carluke's attention. You mean, Dr. John said to me when I had let him study these bits of diary, which he peered into with a magnifier the size of a thimble that he carries in his waistcoat pocket, and is near as much dreaded by malingerers as he is himself, that this is the handwrite of the spectrum? If Dr. John had a failing, it is that he hankers too much to tie one down to a statement, and of course I would not accept this interpretation, for I do not believe in spectrums. It is not known even by the credulous when, in Mr. H's distorted fancy, the spectrum first came chapping softly at the man's door, and afterwards blattering on it in a wicked desire to drive the lawful possessor out of the house and take his place. But it was while the glen was locked. Sometimes one of the twain was inside the house, and sometimes the other. Sounds were heard, they say, coming from the study of voices in conflict and blows struck. The dwellers of that time in the 5 houses, of whom two Carlines are still alive, maintained that they had seen Mr. H. sitting on his dyke at night, because the other was in possession. By this time no servant would bide in the manse after gloaming, and yet, though Mr. H. was now the one chapping at the door, they said they could see a light being carried in the house from room to room, and hear something padding on the floors. He did not walk, they said. He padded. When they found the minister, according to the stories, Dr. John said, his face was an awful mess. What had caused that? I asked, and he said shortly that he supposed spectrums had teeth. It was eerie to reflect that to these 2 Carlines, as we call ancient women, my study must still be more his than mine, and that they would not be taken aback if they came into it at the moment and found the old man in the grandee chair. The wayward woman was a better visitor to the glen than this other, at any rate, I ventured, and the answer he made I would as soon he had kept to himself. Well, according to some, he said with a sort of leer at me, they are the same person. We tried to get on to more comfortable subjects, but it was as if the scholar's story would not leave the room. I feel as if there were 3 of us here tonight, I said to the doctor. Aye, said he, and a 4th keeking in at the window. As usual, the old wife gossip in which we had been luxuriating, for what more was it, was interrupted by Crystalie coming in to announce that our sediment was at an end. She did this not in words, but by carrying away the kettle. This guarded us to our beds, fuming at her, being one of those women, than whom there are few more exasperating, who think all men should do their bidding. I had to be up betimes this morning to see him take the gate. Chapter 4. The Locking of the Glen. December 19th. In this white waste street of a world, the dreariest moment is when custom makes you wind up your watch. Were it not for the Sabbath, I would get lost in my dates. Not a word has gone into my diary for a fortnight past. Now would be the time for it, if there was anything to chronicle. But nothing happens, unless one counts as an event that I brought my hens into the manse on discovering that their toes were frozen to the perch. I had to bring the perch too. My 2 sheep are also in by, and yesterday my garden slithered off to the burn with me on it like a passenger. I've sat down at an antrim time to the diary to try to fill up with an account such as this of the locking of the glen, and the result has been rather disquieting to me, as I will maybe tell farther on, and maybe not. The Glen Road, on which our intercourse with ourselves as well as with the world so largely depends, was among the first to disappear under the blankets. White hillocks of the shape of eggs have arisen here and there, and are dangerous too, for they wobble as though some great beast beneath were trying to turn around. The mountains are so bellied out that they have ceased to be landmarks. The farm towns look to me to be smored. I pull down my blinds so that I may rest my eyes on my blues and reds indoors. But the 5 houses are barely 100 yards away. I have to pick out signs of life with my spyglass. I'm practically cut off from my kind. Even the few trees are bearing white ropes thick as my wrist instead of branches. And the only thing that is a bonny black is the burn, once a mere driblet but now deep, with a lash around the corners and unchancy to risk. At times of ordinary wet, they cross here to the kirk in 2 easy jumps on boulders placed there for the purpose and called the brig. But the boulders are now like sunk boats, and of the sprinkling of members who reached the kirk on the 9th, one used a vaulting pole and lost it. Last Sabbath I did not open the kirk, but got down to the burn and preached to a handful standing on the other side. My heart melted for the Smiths' bairns, every one of whom was there, and I've cried a notice across the burn that next Sabbath the bell will ring as a solemn reminder, but the service will be in the smithy, where I find that man's pole or not. 2 or 3 times Posty, without his velocipedes, penetrated to Brander's and delivered my letters, and a newspaper to me by casting them over the burn tied to stones. There is no word of Dr. John. For nearly a week, except for an occasional shout, I have heard no voice but Crystalie's. I sit up here in nights, trying to get meanings out of Mr. H's diary, and not so much finding them in the written books as thinking I hear them padding up the stair, as a wayward woman might do. In the long days, I go out and shawl and get dunted by slides from the roof. Of an evening, Posty struts up and down in front of the 5 houses, playing on his pipes. I can see him, like a pendulum passing the glints of light. I can hear him from the manse, but still better from the burn side if I slew down to listen in the dark. On one of those nights, I got a dirl in the breast of me. It was when I went back to the manse after hearing him finish that border boast. My name it is Little Jock Elliot. The glen was deserted by all other sound now, but as I burst open the manse door, for the snow had got into the stables, I heard my fiddle playing My Name it is Little Jock Elliot. For a moment I thought that Crystalie was at it, but then I knew she must be bedded, and she has no ear, and it was grander playing than Posty's, though he has a kittle hand. I suppose I did not stand still in my darkened hallen for more than half a minute, and when I struck a light to get at a candle, the music stopped. There's no denying that the stories about the spectrum flitted through me, and it needed a shove from myself to take me up the stair. Of course there was nobody. I'd come back with the tune in my ears, or it was caused by some vibration in the air. I found my fiddle in the lock press just as I had left it, except that it must have been leaning against the door, for it fell into my arms as I opened the press, and I had the queer notion that it clung to me. I could not compose myself till I had gone through my manse with a candle, and even after that I let the instrument sleep with me. More reasonable fancies came to me in the morning, as that it might be hard on a fiddle never to be let do the one thing it can do. Also that maybe, like the performers, they have a swelling to cry out to rivals, I can do better than that. Any allure I might have felt to take advantage of this mere fancy and to put the neck rest beneath my chin again, I suppressed. But I let Posty know he could have the loan of my instrument on condition that he got it across the burn dry. By the smith's connivance, this was accomplished in a cart. It is now my fiddle Posty plays instead of his pipes, which are not in much better condition than his velocipede, and are repaired in a similar manner. I extracted just one promise from him, that he would abstain from the baneful Jacobite lilts he was so fond of, but he sometimes forgets, or excuses himself across the burn by saying, she likes that kind best, and she's ill to control when she's off. 'Tis pretty to hear him in the gloaming, letting the songs loose like pigeons. To write this account of the glen when it is locked has been an effort, for the reason that I have done it twice already, and in the morning it was not there. I sat down by lamplight on both occasions to write it and thought I had completed my task, but next morning I found just a few broken lines and otherwise blank pages. Some of them were repeated again and again, like a cry, such as God help me, as if I were a bird caught in a trap. I'm not in any way disturbed of mind or body, at any rate in the morning. Yet this was what I had written. I'm none so sure but what it may prove to be all I have written again. I will now go and say good night to the old lady, for though it is barely 9:30 on the clock, we keep early hours in the wilderness. This is a moment I owe to her ingenuity. The grand house, which is of course a statelier name of its own, is a steep climb from here, and is at present inaccessible, the approach having thrown in its lot with the fields. But it is visible, and at 9:30 she shoots her blind up and down twice, and now I reply with mine. Hers, I am thankful to say, is red, for the lamp behind it has a red shade, and this shooting of the blinds is our way of saying good night to each other. When she shoots hers 3 times, it means something personal about my gown, and I make no answer. There is a warmth, however, in saying good night to a living being when the glen is so still that I am thinking you could hear a whit-whit on the move. Sometimes I stand by my window long after hers is dumb, and I have felt that night was waiting, as it must have done once for the first day. It is the stillness that is so terrible. If only something would crack the stillness. Chapter 5. The Stranger. December 21st. For the first time since the glen was locked, Dr. John threw in, as we say, this morning. He came straight to the study where he found us at family exercise. I did not look up from my knees, but crystally whispered to me, "Be short," which I dare say made me in consequence a little longer. Yet I knew she would not have taken such a liberty unless there was something untoward with the man, and though I found when I rose that he was on his knees with us, I saw that he had gone to sleep on them. His face was so peaked that I sent Crystally hurrying for the bottle of brandy, which has lain in the manse uncorked since I came here 6 months ago. And as soon as he had partaken, she hauled off his boots and ran him onto the stairhead to wring and scrape him, for he was getting onto the carpet. I saw he ettled to be rid of her before communicating something by ordinaire to me, and he took the best way to effect this by saying in a sentence that he had got through to Joanna Minch, and it was a girl, and both were doing well, whereupon Crystally was off to cry the tidings across the burn. He was nodding in the brandy with fatigue, so that it looked as if only by sudden jerks could he keep his head on. But he brought out the words, "There's more in it than I told Crystally. I've been to the shieling, but I did not get through in time. There were 2 lives saved in that bit house in the small hours, but don't be congratulating me, for I had naught to do with it." Having said this, he fell head foremost into sleep, and I had ill rousing him, which I was swear to do, but he had made it plain that he wanted to say more. "Hey, it's such a camstry tale," he told me, "as might banish sleep in any man. But I am dog-tired, and unless you keep pulling my beard with all the strength that is in you, I'll be doverin again." I must say here that I had to do as he instructed me several times. We must have looked a strange pair, the doctor yawning and going off in the middle of sentences while I tugged fiercely at the beard. I will put his bewildering tale together as best I can. He had forced his way last evening to the farm of Whammel, where a herd was lying with 2 broken legs. While he was there, Fargie Ruth, the husband of Joanna, had tracked him down to say that she was terrible near a reckoning. The doctor started off with him, rather anxious. Fargie was through hither, and it was Johanna's first. Dr. John had floundered into worse drifts, but a store of snow was plastering his face, and he lost Fargie at the slough crossing. He tumbled and rumbled down in a way at which he's a master hand, and reached the shieling hours before the husband, who was a decent stock, but very unusual in the legs. The distance is a short mile when the track is above ground. Dr. John was relieved to smell smoke, for he feared to find he was on a sleeveless errand, and the woman will be found frozen. I told him I knew the house, which is a lonesome, one-roomed cot of double stone and divot with but a bow window. I asked if he had found Joanna alone, but he had taken the opportunity by making a remark to fall asleep again. I got his eyes open in the manner recommended by him, and he said with one of his little leers at me, "She was not quite alone, but maybe you were one of those who do not count an infant till it be christened." "If there is any haste for that," I cried, looking for my boots. "Aye, there is none," he said. "But who had been with her? Was she in such a bad condition that she could give you no information about that?" "Aye, she was in fine condition, and she could, and she did," he said. "I was with her till Fargie, who's gone back to the Whammel, brought down the goodwife, and I've no doubt Joanna is now giving the particulars to them. They are such uncommon particulars," he went on, taking a chew at them, "that I can fancy even the proud infant sitting up to listen." "Then who was it that had acted in his place?" I inquired, not daring to be more prolix lest he should again be overtaken. That, he said, was what he was asking me. "Dr. John, be assured," he said, "that I am too dung owner with Trier to be trifling with you, but this will become more your affair than mine. It's not to be. It's not to me that they will look to be told who she was, but to their minister." "I hope I shall not fail them," I said loftily. Nevertheless, I dreaded what was coming, and I insisted on his keeping awake, or I would lay a hot iron on the beard. He said he had found a kettle on a bright fire, and Joanna in her bed with the child, who was fittingly swaddled in her best brot. He would not let her talk until he had satisfied himself that everything necessary had been done, and then, for the curiosity was mounting to his brain, he said with pretended casualness, "I see you've been having a nice cup of tea." "Aye, merry she was at the making of it," replied Joanna, turning merry herself. "I forgot," said he, "if you mentioned who it was." "Aye, of course, she was one of the strangers," she said. "Of course, it would be one of those curiosities, but I never chanced to fall in with one. What was she like?" "Oh," said Joanna, "she was like the little gentleman that sits under his tail," meaning a squirrel. "I thought she would be something like that," he said. "But had you no fear of her?" Never," said Joanna, "till after the bairn was born, and then for just a short time, when she capered about mad-like with glee, holding it high in the air, and dressing and undressing it in the brot, just to have another peep at it. I'm very proud of what she'd done for me in it, till a queer change came over her. I was thinking that she was going to bite it. I nipped it from her." "To bite them is not my usual procedure at birth," the doctor said, "but we all have our different ways." Joanna gave him a fuller story of the night then, as he said, would be of any profit to a son of a bachelor like Adam Yestreen, but he told me some of its events. The door had blown open soon after Fargie's departure, leaving naught but reek to heat her, and the bowl closed, and when the fire went down, she would have been glad to cry back the reek. She thought the cold candle of her life was at the flicker. The stranger relit the fire, but there was no way she could conceive of heating that body on the box bed. Then the thought came to her. "I should strip herself naked," Joanna said. "Made me keep my feet on her, as if she were one of them pig bottles for toasting the feet of the gentry. And when the feet were warm, she lay close to me, first on one side, then on the other. She was as warm as a browning bannock when she began, but by the time the heat of her had passed into me, well, I suppose she was cold as a trout." As to the actual birth, though this was Joanna's first child, she knew more about the business than did her visitor, who seemed to have been in a dither of importance over the novelty of the occasion. She was sometimes very daring, and sometimes at such a loss that, in Joanna's words, she could just pet me and kiss me and draw droll faces at me with the intent to help me through. And when she got me through, she went skeer with triumph, crying out as she strutted up and down that we were the 3 wonders of the world. The whole affair, Dr. John decided, must have been strange enough to put the wits of any medical onlooker into a bucket, and if he let his mind rest on it, he would not forget how to sleep as well as how to practice surgery. So in the name of charity, would I leave him in the land of Nod for an hour while I thought out some simple explanation for my glen folk? He got his hour, though sorely did I grudge it, for I was in a bucket myself. When he woke refreshed, I was by his side to say at once, as if there had not been a moment's interruption, "Of course she was some neighbour." There was a glint in his blue eyes now, but he said decisively, "Aye, there's no way out by the road, my man. Joanna is acquaint with every neighbour in the glen." "Well, an outside woman of flesh and blood," I prigged with him, "must have contrived to force the glen, as after all you did yourself." That, he maintained, was even less plausible than the other. I was stout for there being some natural explanation, and he reminded me unnecessarily that there was the one Joanna gave. At this I told him sternly to get behind me. I could not forbear asking him if he had any writing of such stories being common to other glens, and he shook his head, which made me the more desperate. He saw in what a stramish I was, and dropping his banter came kindly to my relief. "Do you think," he said in his most helpful, confident way, "that I have any more belief in warlocks and strangers than you have yourself? I'll tell you my conclusion, which my sleep makes clearer. It is that Joanna did the whole thing herself, as many a woman has done before her. She must at some time, though, have been in a trance, which are things I cannot pretend to fathom, and have thought a woman was about her who was not there. It cows to think of a practical kimmer like Joanna having, even in her hour of genius, such an imagination. That bit about nearly biting the bairn is worthy of Mr. H's spectrum." "None of that," I cried. "She's no doubt got that out of the old minister's story." "Aye," he grunted. "Let's say that accounts for it. I admit it is the one thing that has been worrying me. But at any rate, it is of no importance, as we were both agreed that Joanna was by a lonesome. She had no joyous visitor, no. Oh, Mr. Yestreen, it's almost a pity to have let such a pleasantly wayward woman go down the wind." It was far from a pity to me. I was so thankful to him for getting rid of her that I pressed his hand repeatedly. I was done with wayward women. Chapter 6. Superstition and its Antidote. December 26th. I got as far as the shieling 2 days behind Joanna's story, and held a christening, this being the first at which I have ever officiated. The usual course is to have it in the kirk, toward the end of a service, but in urgent cases it may be on the day of birth. There was maybe no reason for precipitancy in this case, the child being lusty, but in the peculiar circumstances I considered it my duty to make her safe. When I took her in my arms, by far the youngest I had ever meddled with, I was suddenly aware of my youthful presumption. I should have been warned beforehand about the beauty of their fingernails. Yet I did not let on that I was the most ignorant in the room, for I was the minister, and therefore to be looked up to. Also, Joanna swore to her visit from the stranger with side looks to me as if she had given birth to a quandary as well as to the little one, and the lave of the party present were already familiar with her story and were all agog. So, knowing how ill it fares with a minister's usefulness if he does not keep up side with his flock, I was bolder than I felt, and told them in a short exposition that there had been no stranger in the affair, otherwise some of them would certainly have seen her. They all nodded their agreement and thanked me for making it so clear, but I knew in my bones that they did not accept one word of my reading up, though they regarded it as very proper for a minister, especially one who was new to the glen. This way they have of heartily accepting what you tell them and then going their own gait is disheartening to me, and at one time I thought of making any dirdom about strangers a subject of strict discipline from the pulpit. Fear did not enter into my reluctance, for I knew they would esteem me the more, the harder I got at them, but I drew back from the ease of superiority toward men and women whose simple lives have been so often more grimly fought than my own. It relieves me, therefore, to have decided that I may get through their chinks more creditably in another matter. Manner. The amelioration in the weather, which probably will not last, is what put the idea into my head. Some of us have been able to step about a little these last days. A current herd, weary of body life, have made so bold as to find out where the glen road is. Of course, they cannot shoal down to it, but they have staked some of the worst bits, and several carts have passed along as if the proximity to it gave them courage. I saw from the manse the old lady's carriage trying for branders, the smith's clink-clink from the smithy, which is the most moory sound in the countryside next to a sawmill, shows that he has had at least one to shod. Posty has ridden on his velocipede the length of the 5 houses and back, with the result that you can hardly see his face for the brown paper. It is true that there is no possibility of opening the kirk on the Sabbath, for though we have thrown planks across the burn with a taut rope to hang on by, the place is too mortal cold for sitting in through a service. There is, however, the smithy, which can be used for other purposes besides preaching. All our large social events take place in the smithy, and the grandest consist of penny weddings, when you are expected, if convenient, to bring, say, a hen or a small piece of plenishing to the happy pair. The actual marriage, of course, takes place in the bride's home and not in the queer English way in the kirk. We've had no weddings since I came, but twice last month we had friendlies, which we consider the next best thing. Our friendlies are always in 2 parts, the first part being devoted to a lecture by the minister or some other person of culture, who is usually another minister, and this lecture is invariably of a bright, entertaining character, and some are greater adepts at unbending in this way than others, the best being Mr. Watery of Branders, whose smile is of such expansion that you might say it spreads over the company like honey. Laughter and the clapping of hands in moderation are not only permissible during the lectures, but encouraged. The second part of a friendly is mostly musical with songs, and is provided by the local talent, in which Posty takes too great a lead. There is an understanding that I remain for the first song or so, whether I am lecturing or in the chair. That is to give a tone to the second part, and then I slip away, sometimes wishing I could bide to enjoy the mirth, but I know my presence casts a shadow on their ease. The time in which friendlies would be most prized is when the glen is locked, but the difficulty for all except the 5 houses lies in getting to the smithy. Nevertheless, we are to attempt a friendly on Thursday, though Mr. Watery, who is to be the lecturer with the magic lantern, which of course is a great addition, has cried off on account of nervousness lest the weather should change before he gets home again. I have undertaken to fill his place to the best of my more limited ability, as indeed it is. I am doing so the more readily because of this idea that came to me, which promises to be a felicitous one. It is to lecture them on superstition, with some sly and yet shattering references to a recent so-called event in the glen, all to be done with a light touch, yet, of course, with a moral, which is that a sense of humour is the best antidote to credulity. There are few of the smaller subjects to which I have given greater thought than to humour, its ramifications and idiosyncrasies, and I have a hope that I may not do so badly at this. I wish Mr. Watery could be present, for I think I can say that I know more about humour than he does, though he is easier at it. Chapter 7. Miss Julie Logan. December the 28th. Hours have passed since I finished my lecture. I know not how many times I've sat down to write about her, and then taken to wandering the study floor instead. My mind goes back in search of every crumb of her, and I am thinking I could pick her up better on my fiddle than in written words. My eyes never fell on her till I got to my peroration. This is no reflection on my sight, for all the company in the smithy, and there were more than 30, had to sit in darkness so they could better watch my face between the 2 candles. She was with Mistress Lindenich, who presented me to her, and they came over to the manse while the Shelties were being yoked. I held her hand to guide her across the planks. She's the old lady's grandniece, and her name is Miss Julie Logan. I'm glad of her Christian name, for it has always been my favourite. In the past few years, up to this night, my lot had thrown me mostly among my seniors, and a glow that once I knew seemed to be just a memory, warning me that ministers must be done quickly with the clutches of youth. I am no hand at describing the garb of beauty, and the nearest I can get to her, after much communing, is that she is a long stalk of loveliness. She carried a muff of fur, and at times would raise it to her face as if she knew no better than to think it was a scent bottle, or peep over it like a sitting bird in the bole of a tree. The upper part of her attire was black, and the rest green. There was a diverting mutch on her head which, for some reason I cannot as yet determine, you could have got on smiling terms with, though you had met it hanging on a knob. She's from Edinburgh, and it was to get her that I saw the grand house carriage fighting its way to Branders yesterday. I had only seen her for 20 minutes. There was such a beloved huskiness in her voice that she should be made to say everything twice. She glides up a man's stair with what I have to take to be the livesomeness of a panther. I like her well when she is haughty, and even better when she is melting, and best of all when she is the 2 together, which she often is. I was all through hither when she sat down on one of my chairs that I had hitherto held to be of the least account. She looked as meek at that moment as if a dove was brooding in her face. It is not the beauty of a person that I heed, but internal beauty, which in her is as plain to read as if she wore it outside. What I would last part with is the way her face sparkles, not just her eyes, but her whole face. This comes and goes, and when it is gone, there is left the sweet homeliness that is a woman's surest promise to man. Fine I knew forever that I needed none but her. Fain would I have made observations to her that put a minister in a favourable light. I'm thinking that the old lady spoke at times, for she's a masterpiece at conversation, but all I remember of her is that she soon fell asleep in the grandee chair, which is a common way she has. This disregard of her company has sometimes annoyed me at Kirk meetings. We have to pause till she wakes up, but not on this occasion. In my lecture, I had spoken about humour, which is profound, and humour, which is shallow, such as pulling away your chair. Miss Julie Logan said to me in the manse that she was only interested in the profound kind with its ramifications and idiosyncrasies. She said she found it a hard kind to detect and wished she could be instructed as to recognise profound humour, whether written or spoken. When she said this, there was something so pleading in her shining eyes that instead of replying in a capable manner, I offered to explain the thing with a bit of paper and a pencil. I drew a note of exclamation and showed her how they were put into books at the end of sentences to indicate that the mark was of a humorous character. She got the loan of the pencil and practiced making notes of exclamation under my instruction. She said she questioned whether profound humour would not still baffle her in the spoken word, and I agreed that here it was more difficult, but told her that if you watched a speaker's face narrowly, you could generally tell by a glint in it, and if there was no glint, his was the mistake, and not yours. She asked me to say something humorous to her, the while she would watch for the glint, which I did, and she saw it. She said she feared it would be a long time before she could do my glint, and asked me to watch her face while she practiced it, and I was very willing. She said she would like to have my opinion on the statement of an Englishman about the bagpipes, namely that they sound best if they are far away from them, and the farther away the better. Other people present had laughed at that, and could I tell her why? I said that no doubt what they laughed at was the man's forgetting that if you were too far away from the pipes, you would not hear them at all. Even in these moments, I was not such a gawk as to be unaware that I was making a deplorable exhibition of myself. Whatever she seemed to want me to say, I just had to say it, for the power had gone from me to show her that I was not mentally deficient. However, when it came to this about the pipes, I broke up and laid my face on the table, and she raised my head and was woebegone when she saw the ruin she had made. "Have I hurt you?" she asked, and I could just nod. "Why did you let me?" she said with every bit of her, and I answered darkly, "I cannot help saying or doing whatever Miss Julie Logan wants." The wet glittered on her eyes in a sort of contest, as you can sometimes hear them do on the strings. I said, "It is bitter mortifying to me to be seen in such disadvantageous circumstances by Miss Julie Logan at the very time of all others when I would have liked to be better than my best." I stroked her muff, and somehow the action made me say, "This is a very unhomely manse," though I had never thought that before. She held out her hand to me with the palm upwards like one begging for forgiveness, and I've been wondering ever since what she meant me precisely to do with it. I pressed it on my heart, and I filled at long last with what becomes a man in his hour, and I said, "I love you, Miss Julie Logan." And she said, as soft as a snowflake, "Yes, I know." Then Christely came in with the blackberry wine on a server, and when Miss Julie Logan drank it, I could see her throat flushing as it went down, which they say also happened with Mary Stuart. Then the old lady woke up and said that the ponies must be yoked by this time, so I took the ladies across to the carriage, Christely going in front with the lamp. I could hear Miss Julie Logan talking sweetly to her, but it was the old lady who was on my arm. It is now on the chap of midnight, and since I wrote the above, I have been down to my kirk and unlocked the door, lit the candle, and stood looking for a long time at the manse pew. It is in a modest position, on the right of the pulpit, disdaining to call attention to itself. For my part, I could never walk down the aisle of any kirk without being as conscious of which was the manse pew as of which was the pulpit. I do not look, I just feel it. Usually there is only Christely in my pew, and she sits at the far end. Not all manse pews have a door, but mine has, and I would sit next to it if I were out of the pulpit, which can only be if another minister is officiating for me. When a minister is a married man, as all ministers ought to be, it is the lawful right of his wife to sit next to the door, with a long empty space between her and the servant, unless they be blessed with children. I stood by my man's pew, picturing Miss Julie Logan sitting next the door. She's a tall lady, and I wondered whether the seat was too low for her. And such is my condition that, if I had brought nails and a hammer with me, I would have raised it, there and then. Chapter 8. Christally Goes Queer. December the 30th. In the midst of my exultation came disquieting symptoms in Christally. I think, now I look back, that she has been unsettled these past few days, and that occasionally she has glanced covertly at me as if she feared I suspected her of something. Whether this was so or not, she is in a bad state now, and I am very ravelled in my mind about her. It showed itself this morning, when I made a remark to her about Miss Julie Logan. I knew it would be more befitting not to bring that name into everyday conversation, but something within me hankered to hear how it sounded on other lips. Nothing could have been more carefully casual than the way I introduced the subject, and yet the dryness came into my mouth that makes it so desirable for a public speaker to have a glass of water handy. And so, I said, there is a young lady at the grand house now, Christally. Is there? Said she, like one cheering up for gossip. Did you not know, I inquired, that there is Miss Julie Logan, that is where Miss Julie Logan is staying? What Miss Julie Logan? She asked. Young lady, I said patiently, whom Mistress Lindennock brought to the manse the night before last. I saw no young lady, she said. There was just the two of you came in, you and Mistress Lindennock. Is this temper, Christally? I demanded, or what is it? You helped Miss Julie Logan to a glass of blackberry wine. Also, you carried the lantern when I escorted them back to the carriage, and you were in front conversing with her. Her eyes stood out as in some sudden affliction, and when I stepped towards her asking if she was ill, she cried, God help me, and rushed out to the study. What did it portend? Had I unwittingly opened the door to some secret the poor soul had been keeping from me? I was very riven, and I followed on her heels to the kitchen, but she had locked the door, and no answer could I get when I spoke through the keyhole to her. This was very disturbing from such an excellent woman, and I went on my knees with the door between us, and called in a loud voice to the malevolent one to come out of her. I could hear her wailing sore. With much perturbation, I got across to the 5 houses on the chance of finding Dr. John, as Posty's wife is down with a complaint that beats the skill of her neighbours. The silly Todd has found out that she is 4 years older than she thought, and though until that moment in robust health, she at once took to her bed. Fortunately, I got the doctor, and on our way across I told him of what had happened. I was relieved to find that he did not take the matter with my seriousness. Indeed, he was more interested in Miss Julie Logan, of whom he had not heard till now, than in Christally's case, which he foretold would turn out to be tantrums brought on by my writing so many love letters. It seems, though news to me, that Christally is responsible for tattle about my sitting for hours writing love letters, these being what she has made of my diary. However meddlesome this is, it took a load from my mind, and I was feeling comfortable when he went off to the kitchen, grinning and declaring that he would shake her like a doctor's bottle. He was gone for a long time, and it was a very different Dr. John who came back. I have seen him worry his way through some rasping ordeals, but never showing the least emotion. Now, however, he was in such a throb that at sight of him I cried out, Is it as bad as that? It's bad, he said. Well, it is so bad and so unexpected that for the first time in my practice I cannot even pretend to know how to act. Let me be for a minute. He paced the floor, digging his gnarled fists into his eyes, a way he has when in pursuit of a problem, as if the blackness thus created helped him to see better. And there's one of 2 things that must be done, he said, and I have got to choose, but the responsibility is very terrible. I waited, thinking he was to take me into his confidence, but instead he just fell to staring in a kind of wonderment at me. I began to assure him that every help I could give would be forthcoming, and at that he gave a jarring laugh. I was offended, but he was at once contrite and asked for my advice. Well, we could ask the young lady to come down with Miss Lindennock and show herself, I suggested. No, we could not, he said. so sharply that I got stiff again. He put the matter right, though, when he told me of the two courses he had to decide between, for, after all, what I had proposed was one of them. Namely, to confront the poor sufferer with the two ladies, which he called the kill or cure step. The second course was to go canny for a few days in the hope the hallucination might pass of itself. She might even wake up on the morrow without it, which at the worst would be a more gentle awakening than the other. He asked me, not like a consultant, but as one who needed a much stronger man to lean on, which line of action I would prefer to be taken if I was in Christely's place. And on consideration, I admitted that the first one seemed to carry the most grievous shock. After some discussion, we decided to give the softer plan a short trial. I said there could be no harm in it at any rate. He said, still very worried, indeed he was shaking, that there might be great harm in it, but that he would risk it. We agreed that, as on all subjects save the one, she was as right as I was. It would be best for me in our daily intercourse to be just my usual, but not talk to her as if I knew she was possessed by an evil spirit. As the doctor was anxious she should be kept from brooding, I also agreed to a proposal from him that her brother Laurie, who is at present at a loose end in Brandes, should pay a visit to the manse for a few days, ostensibly to brighten her, but really, of course, to watch her on the quiet. This gives small promise for the time being of a comfortable manse, but what is running in my head even now is that tomorrow afternoon I go, be the weather what it likes, to the grand house to see Miss Julie Logan again. It will be the last day of the year, but Laurie should be here by then, and Christely will be safe in his care. Today I am keeping an observant eye on her myself. She has brought up my meals in her old exemplary way, and we have exchanged a few courteous words about household affairs. But her face is sore begretted, and if I try to be especially kind to her, she knows the reason, and there is more than a threatening of a breakdown. Poor woman. It is like to be a sad New Year's Eve to her, and a heavy one too for Dr. John, who left the manse very broken. As I let him out, I said, "It is as if the spectrum had come back to this house." "Wished man," he said. Chapter 9. The End of a Song. December 31st. I will try to put down the events of this terrible night with clearness and precision. It was in the early afternoon, the snow shimmering like mica, which is sheep's liver, that I set out for the grand house buttoned very thick. Despite the darkness that encompassed Christely, I was in an awful and sublime state of happiness. This may have got into my very appearance and made it unusual, for I met some of the Smithsburns who generally run to me, but they hinted back. When I asked what flayed them, one said, "Your face has come so queer." I could have danced to them in the snow from sheer joy. I'm not sure but what I did dance, though I never learned it. Some of the windows in the 5 houses already showed a gleam of light, not that it was needed yet, but my folk were practising precautions against my seeing them presently, for it is always a night of solemn gaiety. These precautions largely consisted in hanging heavy clothes such as human habiliments behind the blinds, so as to deaden the light to me should I be watching from the manse. There was no music as yet, and I was wondering where Posty and my fiddle were, when I fell in with him on the way. Though he has forgotten who the broken men were about whom he likes to play, I noticed that one little bit from his forebears, as I take it, still clings to him. He walks up and down while he is playing the fiddle, as if it were the pipes. On this occasion, however, I expect he was on the march for seasonable largesse at the grand house, which I am sure he always receives with complete surprise. A thing commonly said about the grand house is that it should be called the grand houses, there being in a manner 2 of them, though the one is but a reflection of the other in a round of water close by. This lochie is only a kitten in size, but deep, and I know not whether its unusual reflective properties are accidental or, as some say, were a device of olden times to confuse the enemy when in liquor. At any rate, one cannot easily tell in certain lights, unless they are particular about things being upside down, which is the house and which the reflection. There is an unacceptable tale of the lord of the glen having been tracked to the house after Culloden, and of the redcoats being lured by a faithful retainer into the water, where they tried doors and windows till they drowned, the lord and his faithful retainer kicking over the edge at them and crying, "Bo." The house is of many periods, but its wonder is the banqueting hall, or rather, a window therein. They never banquet now in the hall, not even the English, and indeed it is nigh empty of gear except for tapestries on the wall, which the ignorant take to be carpets damaged in the 45. The great bowed window was said by travelled persons to stand alone among windows, for it is 28 feet in height and more than half as wide. All who come to look at it count its little lozens, as we call the panes, which are to the number of 216. These panes are made of some rare glass that has a tint of yellow in it, so that whatever the weather is, to anyone inside the hall it looks to be a sunny day. In the glen, this glass is not thought much of, and they say it should be renewed. The house is a bit old and weary, and I dare say these lozens are the only part of it that would shame renewal. It was not here, but in a bean little chamber, where however indiscriminately you sit down, you sit soft, that Mistress Lindenauer received me. She was tatting, but that cannot be the right word, at a new tapestry, or mending an old one, which was so voluminous that she rose out of it as from the snow. She is such a little old person that when she stands up you may think she has sat down. Nevertheless, she is so gleg at coming to the boil that contradictious men have stepped back hurriedly from the loof of her hand, and yet not been quick enough. She has always, as I have said, been a fine friend to me, till this unhappy day. She was the same woman, though unusual quiet while we were talking of the ravel Christely was in, which I did not have to stress, as I found Dr. John had obligingly gone straight to her with the story from the manse yesterday. I could not help inquiring, with all the look of its being an oral question, how he had taken to Miss Julie Logan. Sharp, I got the dreadful answer. Well, he had no opportunity, for I had already packed the woman back to Edinburgh. I was to have worse blows than this tonight, though at the moment I could not have credited it, so I will only say that when I rallied I asked with cold politeness when the young lady was coming back. Mistress Lindenauer, I could see, was eyeing me closely to find out how I stood the news, but she replied at once, like one prepared for war. Well, never, I hope. I don't like your Miss Julie Logan, my good sir. I will not say that even in that stern moment I got no gliff of pleasure out of hearing her called my Miss Julie Logan. Also, it gave me an opportunity to reply with a thunderbolt. That is what I want her to be. She stamped her foot at me, but I never weakened. I demand her address, I said. She refused it, and I replied loftily that it mattered not, as I was confident she would write to me. She raised her arms at that, like on appealing to a higher power, and said, if she writes to you, I give the thing up. When she swung me round with a rage I could not construe, and said on her tiptoes, I could tell you things about her, any one of which would make you drop her in the burn, but you were standing in the middle of it with the jade in your arms. I replied in my stateliest, which has froze many, that I would stand defiant in the middle of the ocean with Miss Julie Logan on those terms, and I meant it too, though I am no swimmer. I dare say I was a rather dignified spectacle, towering there, very erect, with my arms folded. At any rate, she shuddered like one cowed who had never been cowed before, or else she became cunning, for she prigged with me to do as she, my old friend, wanted, saying endearing things about how much she had liked me in the days when I was sensible, and that if I were not such a calf, I would see she was now fonder of me and my imbecility. Her words were not all, as will be seen, fittingly chosen, nor did I like the pity with which she glowered at me, for she was the one in need of it. Yet I had a melting for her at moments, especially as I was going away with but a scantling of courtesy. When she said that it would be the first time I had left her house, and she might have added any house in the glen, without calling for a benison on it, I stood rebuked. As we went on our knees, she whispered rather tremulously, Pray, dear minister, for all who may be in trouble this night, and even danger. And I did so, and it made the tangled woman greet. Of course, I presumed she meant Christely, but as I was shaking hands with her, my mind took a shrewd turn, and I said almost threateningly, You were not referring, were you, to Miss Julie Logan? It spoilt the comparative friendliness of our parting, for she flared up again and said, Indeed no, she is the only one that is in no need of those words tonight. Unfortunate being, she little knew, nor did I, the impiety of that remark. When I got outside, I was like one with no gates to go. The tea half of me was warring with the other half. I sat down very melancholic by the little round of water I have spoken of. The night was forlorn, with the merest rim of the moon in sight, and no reflections on the water beyond some misty stars. I don't know why I sat there. It was not to keep vigil. I'm sure I had no suspicion that Miss Julie Logan was still in the house. I may have been there a considerable time before I saw or heard anything. What I heard came first, distant music. It may just have been Posty playing far away, the more reprehensible but the loveliest of all the Jacobite cries. Will you no come back again? Soon after he finished, if it was mortal man who played, all was as still again as if the death cart my folk tell about was nearing the glen to cart away the old year. Candles to a great number and very sly were beginning to get lit in the water. I spied on them, interestedly. The full moon was now out of the clouds, and it was one of those nights when she wonders. The big window nearly filled the pond, and through it I saw a throng of people in the hall. So long as my eyes were fixed on the water, of course, it was only their reflections I saw. I saw them on their heads as in an inverted mirror, and they looked just as agreeable as the other way. Maybe nature herself does things with a disordered mind in the last gasp of the year. They were in the Highland dress of lang syne. I never saw them all at once, because if they came nearer, they were lost in the weeds, and if they went back, they had a neat way of going through the walls. The older ladies were in fine headdresses, and others in their ringlets. They were more richly attired than the men, yet the men made the finer show. I could see the trews and an occasional flashing silver button or a gleam of steel, but near all colour had been washed out of them, as if they had been all along among the caves and the eagles. There was plenty of food on a table that sometimes came forward, and they drank toasts thereat. I could not always put a meaning to what they did, but I saw them dancing and conversing, and though they were perhaps poor and desperate, they all, the gentlemen as much as the ladies, seemed to me to be of the great. They did ruchly things as if they had forgotten the pretty ways, and next minute there would be a flourish in their manners that would have beat the pipes. There was no music, though, and when this came to me I minded that I was not getting a sound across the water from the hall itself, though owing to the quietness of the night I heard in it opened as infinitely small a thing as the letting go of a twig. The company were as quiet as their reflections. This made me look across the pond at the window itself, which so far I'd been duking, lest the company there should take tent of me. I had a mistrust they were up to ploys that were not for a minister to see, and would mischief me if they catched me spying. But that stealthy stillness garred me look up, and I took a step or two to see better. They were all on the move, but at once stopped, hands on dirk, and I opined they suspected a watcher. I duck it, and after that, except for a wink now and again, I looked at nothing but the reflections. I knew I was in danger, but this did not greatly fash me, so long as I was not catched. I had never lost a feeling, but there was an air of expectancy about them. I saw them backing against the walls to leave more space in the middle, and all eyes turned to the door as if awaiting a great person. I suppose the tune was still swimming in my head, for I thought I knew who was coming in, he who was fed from the eagle's nest, and I had a sinking that it would be my duty to seize him and hand him over. But it was a woman. It was Miss Julie Logan. She was not finely attired like the other ladies, but so poorly that her garments were in tatters. She would have made a braver show if each of the ladies had torn off an oddment and made a frock for her between them. It was not, however, as one of little account that they treated her, or she treated them. She was the one presence in the hall to them. They approached her only when she signed to them that she could do with it, and as if overpowered by the distinction that was befalling them. The men made profound obeisance, and the ladies sank in that lovely way to the floor. On some she smiled and let them salute her hand, and others she looked at in a way I did not see, but they backed away from her, as if she had put the fear of death into them. She gave the back of her hand to Mistress Lindenauer, and I never saw an old woman look so gratified. With a few she took a step or two in the dance, mayhap to make others glower, and soon something was taking place they could not at first fathom. It was clear that she was about to leave them, for a ceremony similar in most respects to that with which she had been received was repeated, and the doors thrown open for her passing. But then they all gathered in the far end of the hall, or sank through it with their backs to her, which was baffling for me, for up to that moment you could see how carefully they gave her their faces. Yet they did it of set purpose, or possibly at her command, for she was watching them more haughtily than ever. As soon as she was sure that every face was to the wall, a complete change came over her. She hastened, she almost ran in her eagerness to a corner of the window, and lifted from the floor a good-sized basket that I dare say they had placed there for her. She lifted it like one who knew for certain it would be there. She filled it with viands from the table, picking and choosing them with affectionate interest. I thought that being in some way I had to grope for, the one they held the highest, she was too proud to let them know how hungry she was. That very knowledge was what had made them place the basket so handily, and look the other way while she filled it. I thought that reckless of correct behaviour, as all on that side were, they were strangers, come trailing back into the present day under a command to honour and feed one who had long ago been left behind. While she had been lording it so imperiously in the hall, she was belike thinking more about the basket than she was the last supper's song. A moment after she was gone from the hall with a withering look for any peeping face, I heard the first sound that had reached me from the house since I took to looking in the water. It was the closing of the front door. I hurried forward and was in time to meet Miss Julie Logan, no longer a reflection, coming down the steps with the basket. She said, "Carry the basket, Adam." And I carried it. But first I put my topcoat on her, and she slipped my hand into one of the pockets along with her own. I think it was snowing again, or a tempest or something of the kind, but we were not heeding. She took me to a small ruin of a bield for sheltering sheep in. In a corner of it there was a pile of stones, maybe to mark some old grave, and we sat down on them and opened the basket. She was very hungry, and I myself was also slow to desist from eating. For drinking, we ate the snow, against which I have warned my Sunday Sabbath school scholars. The basket was so crammed with food of an engaging nature that when we paused, replete, there was still near a basketful left. Never in my life was I so merry as sitting on these stones. And she was also very droll. She had a way of shining her face close into mine and showing her pretty teeth like a child. It was the gaiety of her, but I did not quite like it. When we wandered on, I wanted to bring the basket, but she said that was the place to leave it. We said the kind of things a man and woman never say till they know each other through and through. It was all about ourselves, and love was one of the words I did not scruple to handle. We were not bothering about the far back times or Mistress Lindenegg, but when we came to the barn, it reminded me of what the old lady had said I would do in a certain hap. Miss Julie Logan reminded me to repeat to her the exact words, which I did, with one exception, namely, "I could tell you things about her, any of which would make you drop her in the burn. You were standing in the middle of it with the jade in your arms." I omitted the word jade, so as not to lessen the old lady. Miss Julie Logan was in a dance of delight and handed me back my coat, crying, "Adam, let us try it." I said there was danger in it, and she said, "Well, I like danger fine." And she coaxed me, saying, "When you've got me there, I'll tell you what the old lady meant, and then, if you don't drop me, belike I will be yours, Adam." I lifted her in my arms, and in the exultation of my man's strength, she was like one without weight. I carried her into the burn. It was deep and sucking. She rubbed her head on my shoulder in a way that would make a man think she liked to be where she was. She peeped up at me and thought, I'm thinking now, she was way for both of us, though she was glittering too. She said, "Kiss me first, Adam, in case you have to drop me." I kissed her. "Hold me closer," she said, "lest by some dread undoing you should let me slip." I held her closer. "Adam, dear," she said, "it is this. I am a papist." At that awful word I dropped her in the burn. That she is still there, I do not doubt, though I suppose she will have been carried farther down. I have written this clear statement in the study to be shown by Laurie to Dr. John, and by him to the Branders Constabulary. I have put down everything exactly as it happened, and I swear to its accuracy. I refused to go to my bed this night, and I know that Laurie is sitting on a chair outside my door. I've told him none of the facts, but I can see that the man already suspects me. I can remember nothing after I heard the splash, but he says he found me running up and down the waterside, and that he had to take a high hand with me to get me home. I would not change out of my wet things for all his blustering, but Crystalie, her face swollen with misery, came bursting in and tore them off me and put me into something dry. This is the last service she will ever render me. Chapter 10, A Quarter of a Century. It is a quarter of a century since I stopped writing this diary, put the thing out of my sight. Circumstances made me want to look through it again, and there it was in the garret, between the same two boards of waxcloth where I'd kept it hidden from Christely in the days of my windy youth. I'd forgotten that it was written on sermon paper, and such dereliction from propriety disturbs my conscience now even more than the vapours set down in it about the Roman woman. Of course, I am aware now that she never existed. I've been aware all these 25 years that I was the one who went queer and not the self-sacrificing Christely. And it was to watch me that the man Laurie was brought to the manse, and that the story the old lady told me was invented for her by Dr. John. My two good friends had to work their way through thorns to clear my disordered mind, but they managed it by the time the Glen Road had come up again like a spring flower. I was long pithless and bedded with fevers, for which the doctor blamed the burn, and in that quiet time I got rid of all my delusions. Though once, in the middle of my rally, I escaped everybody and made for the sheep mill to decide for certain that the basket was not still there. I was perfectly sane, and yet I did that. The result of my escapade was to retard my recovery for another month. I left the Glen for good, early in August, just before the return of the English, with whom, though I liked them well, I had no desire to have further discourse about diaries or what may seem to happen when the Glen is locked. I have had 2 charges since I gave up my first, and for 18 years I have been minister in this flourishing place in a mining district. 2 years after my call, I married a lady of my neighbourhood, and it has been a blessed union, for my Mima is 1 in 1,000, and the children grow in grace. I tell Mima everything, except about the Roman, that being a passage in my life that never took place, nor have I sufficient intellect to be able to speak about it without doing so as if it were real. I'm thankful to say that the Roman is to me as if she never had been, and of course she never was, that just being a slip of the pen. A Scottish minister has few top coats in his life, and when any old clothes will suffice, I sometimes wear the one that is in the diary. Many a night in this part, where the rain turns black as it alights, I have been out in the old topcoat without remembering how pretty she looked in it, and this is natural, for she never was in it. I have only once revisited my first charge, and it was a month ago. I stayed at night at Brander's with Dr. John, who's got a partner now. My old friend's hold on life has become little more than a bat's to a shutter, but he will still be at it, and some day I suppose he'll be found among his own hills, stiff and content. I walked down the glen through the heather, a solitary, unless it may be said that, in the sense the young Adam I had been walked with me. The English were on the hills, but they were not my English. I lay for 2 nights in the old mansion, preached twice. They were not great sermons, but are held by some to be my 2 best, and I keep them for visits. The lad that once I was thought himself a gifted preacher, but the man he became knows better. That is nothing to boast of. There is naught that hooks the spirit from you so much as knowing better. Mr. Gallagher, who is the new minister, the second in succession to me, was preaching at Brander's, and his wife, a genteel thick lady, sat in my old pew nearest the door. He gave me, may I be forgiven, a sort of scunner of her. Gallagher was very civil, but he is not the kind of man, I think, the old lady would have waved good night to with her window blind. She, of course, has been away with it this many a year. There is a new postman who, 'tis said, has trudged a distance equal to round the world since the days of my postie. Christely is married on a provision merchant in Ireland, and once a year sends me a present of eggs with a letter inquiring very guardedly about my health. Joanna Minch and the lass have gone to some other glen. The only faces I could give a name to in the 5 houses are the smith and 2 of his sons. The once lusty man is now an old carle sitting on his dyke, having reached that terrible time for a Scotsman of knowing that he will never be allowed by his well-intentioned offspring to do another day's work for ever and ever. Sometimes, to give him an hour's pride, they let him wheel a barrow. He will have to die gradual on a fine bed of straw, but he would rather be gotten with his hammer in his hands. There have been great changes at the manse, inside and out. One hardly knows the study now, for there is a sofa from the fireplace. It has a grate. They burn coal. I had sold the Grandee to Mr. Gallagher, and one could see by the look of it that it had never missed me. There is an erection containing a foreign plant on the identical spot where the Roman sat, but she never sat there. Outside, the chief change in the manse is that Mr. Gallagher has lifted the hen house to the gable end, which I consider a great mistake. He has also cut down my gean tree. The glen has not been what can be called locked for the last 8 years, and Mr. Gallagher knows very little about the old superstitions that plagued young Adam. He had heard something nonsensical about a red-shanked man on a horse whose hoof make no marks, a poor affair, though unaccountable. Mr. Gallagher was very sound about the hallucinations all being clavers unworthy of investigation, and on that point at least we were in agreement. I asked him, just to keep the conversation going, if any stranger woman had been seen, but he had heard of none. Nor could he, for there never was one. Of course, I could not go for a walk on the Sabbath day, but as I was leaving the Branders on the Monday, I got up betimes to have a last wander in the glen. I did not specially want to do this, and I prefer to put it that the fillip came from the Adam I had been. The sun soon got very masterly, though there was a nip in the air at first, and I made the mistake of wearing the old topcoat. I sat for a time among the heather by the pond, where the reflection from the grand house is still to be seen, but it is somewhat spoilt by a small windmill having been erected close by to provide the breeze in which, 'tis said, the trout rise best. I am told that this was Posty's last contrivance to make things easy for the English. I thought with little respect to the Jacobites and the 45, and a dog that may have been of old descent drove me away. I went on to the Bield, but nothing is left of it now except the pile of stones. I stood looking for a long time at the place where we had left the basket. I went to Joanna's shieling, though I knew she was gone, and I found it gone too. I just went because I was sure that Joanna's visitor had been my visitor. They were both in a dram when we thought we saw her. I liked to mind the Roman's bonny act in making a pig of herself to heat the cold body of Joanna. I wished she'd been given a chance to do this. She would have done it, if she could. I went to the Eagle's Rock, and it looked the more sinister because there was a scarf of rime hiding the Logan stone. When the rime drifted, I thought I could see the stone shogging. I left my visit to the burnside to the end. There is now a swinging bridge for the convenience of churchgoers in the back end of the year, but though little more than a wimple of water was running and sometimes coming to a standstill, I found the exact bend in the burn where I dropped her, if she had been there to drop. I stood, unruffled, keeping an iron grip on myself, my mind so rid of the old fash that I marvelled at my calm. It was not so, however, with my topcoat, which I found becoming clammy cold, as if recalling another time by the burn, and feeling we were once again too near for safety. You might have said it tugged at me to come away, but that, of course, was just a vagary of my mind. The young Adam in me must have had the upper hand for looking back. I see it was to him rather than to me it happened. He thought he had catched into his arms something padding by, whose husky voice said Adam lovingly, the while her glamorous face snuggled into his neck the way a fiddle does. Next moment he gave a cry because he thought he was running with blood, and even I had a sinking till I tried my throat with my handkerchief. Whatever had been there was gone now, and I hurried away myself, for I was as shaken as if it had been the spectrum. I bided the night at Branders with Dr. John, to whom all my story was so familiar, except just one happening that I had always sworn never to reveal even to him. We sat long over his pipe, talking about what he called the old dead and done affair. We were very intimate that night, the one of us an ancient and the other getting on. Why, let us be thankful, the doctor said, that it can all be so easily construed, for the long and short of it is that you were just away in your mind. Any other construing of it would be too uncomfortable to go to our beds on even now. I said, taking a higher line, it is not even allowable. And yet we discussed the possibility of its having had any backing to it for, I suppose, the last time. This would have meant that the glen, instead of its minister, does sometimes go queer in the terrible stillness of the time when it is locked. We should have to think, the doctor said, with the kettle in his hand, that it all depended on the stillness of the glen. If it got to be stiller than themselves, it woke them up, and they were at their old ploys again. I am not seeing, I said, how even that could bring me into it. Nor am I, he agreed, pouring out cosily. But let us say that in such incredible circumstances, you might, by some untoward accident, got involved while the rest of us escaped. The word accident is not a friend of mine, and so, or for some other reason, I said, I would rather think she'd picked me out. He smiled at that, not grasping that I was speaking for young Adam. Maybe, he said to make me laugh, but failing. It was her echo that was in the glen, and by some mischance you got into the echo. Then he grew graver, and said he would have none of these superstitions. The affair could only be construed naturally so long as we accepted the experience I once thought I had gone through as having been nothing but the fancies of a crazy man. All of them, I could not help saying. Every one, said he, clapping me confidently on the shoulder. Do you not see, man, that if any one of them was arguable, it would be less easy to dispose of the lave? That day, during my illness, I said, and I was but 3 parts convinced by your construing and slipping away from you all to the bield to make certain that the basket was not there. Aye, precisely, said he. That would be a case in point. What strange ravels might we have got entangled in if you had found that basket? My many years old resolution to keep the thing dark from all, even from him, broke down, and I spoke out the truth. Dr. John, I told him. I did find the basket that day. For long he threw it with me that I was away in my mind again, but he had to listen to me while I let out the tale, which had ceased to perturb me. I have a sort of shiver at writing it down. I found the basket with its provender in the bield where we had left it, and at that the peace which had been coming to me threatened to go, and my soul was afflicted. I prayed long, and I took the basket down to the burn and coopered its sodden gear therein, and itself I tore to bits and scattered. It was far worse to me in that time to think that she had been than that she was just a figment of the brain. I told all this to Dr. John, and at first he was for spurning it, nor can I say for certain that he believes it now. I leave it at that, but fine I know it would be like forsaking the callant that once I was to cast doubt on what lies folded up in his breast. I am back now, secure and serene in my mining town, which in many ways, with its enterprise and modern improvements, including gas and carts to carry away any fluff of snow that falls, is far superior to my first. I have a wider sphere of usefulness of the grand family life. As I become duller in the uptake, time will no doubt efface every memory of Miss Julie of the Logan, and of mornings I may be waking up without the thought that I have dropped her in the burn. Of course, it is harder on young Adam. I have a great drawing to the foolish youth that once I was than I have pretended. When I am gone, it may be that he will away back to that glen.